So we're going to start, folks, as people enter. And I'm Terry Swartz-Russell, and I am the, whatever I am, Director of Family and Adult Education at Temple Emmanuel. And we're thrilled that tonight we're going to learn with Joe Rosenstein about his new book on Pirkei Avot, Reflections on Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, not just what my Rebbe taught me. And he's going to be in conversation after his presentation with Rabbi Robinson. And we're going to ask everybody to remain on mute. And you may put your questions in the chat, but we'd like you to hold them until towards the end so that we can, take them from there and have a conversation. So I'm going to hand this over in a minute to Rabbi Robinson and let her take it away. So
Wonderful. And if you'll all please put yourselves on mute during Joe's talking, we'll be able to hear him well. And I also just want to invite you. We have right now, according to my screen, 36 people here, and that feels like a very auspicious place to begin. Double high. And I just want to say, Joe, I can't even remember exactly how you came into my life at what phase, but your Siddur, which was presented to me by Jerry and Ruth Rose Jacobs, was actually incredibly powerful personally, because you did something that no other person had done. You made what was abstract, what was sort of remote language of prayer, immediate and accessible. And you, through the beautiful Siddur that you created, brought in not only things that we were used to, like the words and the translation and the transliteration, but you also you brought a transliteration so that everybody could access it. And you brought meditations and you brought observations. And as I received, thank you so much, Joe, received this copy of your reflections on Pirkei Avot, I thought a lot about the gift that you have for making what is distant immediate, for helping us to really feel a part of the process. And Joe, you've done it again. And so I want to invite you, you have some words prepared for us, a discourse on Pirkei Avot. So I'm going to invite you to first present your words, your discourse. And I just want to say to you, I thank God every day that I had the blessing to meet you and to be able to call you. You say this is not just what your Rebbe taught you, but although you are a professor of mathematics, I can say that so much of what you teach is what my Rebbe has taught me, and my Rebbe in this matter is you.
I don't know where to begin now, because that's such a wonderful introduction. So thank you very, very much. I very much appreciate everything that you have said. So let me first thank you and Temple Emmanuel for giving me this opportunity to talk with you about my new book on Pirkei Avot, and to thank all of the people who have come to this evening's program. It's grown from double high to almost 3 times high since you last mentioned it. Now, there have been hundreds of books, literally hundreds of books written about Pirkei Avot in English, and thousands in Hebrew. Pirkei Avot is commonly referred to, as you know, as Ethics of the Fathers. And you might be wondering how my book is different from all of its predecessors. As we recently sang, Ma nishtana hasefer hazeh mikol hasfarim. How is this book different from all the other books? So I will answer that question momentarily, but first, I will start by placing Pirkei Avot in context. Avot, not Pirkei Avot, but Avot is a small section of the Mishnah, which was compiled in about the year 200 of the Common Era by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi based on earlier work done by Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, and others in previous generations. The Mishnah has 6 sections. As we sang in Echad Mi Yodea and at the Seder, who knows one, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, who knows 6? 6 are the books of the Mishnah. These 6 books are divided into about 75 sections, one of which is called Avot. The focus of the Mishnah in general is halacha, regulations for the new version of Judaism created by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers after the destruction of the temple in the year 70 in the Common Era. Avot is the only portion of the Mishnah that has no halacha. It doesn't have any regulations. Instead, it contains ethical teachings, hence the name Ethics of the Fathers. It has advice to judges and would-be judges. It has advice to Torah scholars and would-be Torah scholars. And it has aphorisms addressed to the general population. The teachers who are cited in Avot span 500 years, from approximately 300 before the Common Era to the year 200 of the Common Era. There are 5 chapters in Avot, containing the teachings of about 70 sages, presented approximately in chronological order. The later sages had to reconstruct from memory what the earlier sages had said, since they could not interview them, and their teachings were likely not written down. About 1,000 years ago, the practice originated of studying one chapter of Avot on each Shabbat between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, since Shabbat occurs 6 times during this period, a 6th chapter was added to Avot, and the resulting collection was called Pirkei Avot. And I remember as a youngster studying Pirkei Avot on Shabbat afternoons in the spring with my Rabbi on his small porch. We went through Pirkei Avot one Mishnah after another, as it is commonly studied and as it is commonly presented in commentaries on Pirkei Avot. So in an hour or 2 on a Shabbat afternoon, we could study all of the teachings in one chapter of Pirkei Avot. The title of my book is Reflections on Pirkei Avot, not just what my Rebbe taught me. And I will now discuss some of the ways in which this book goes beyond a brief discussion of each individual Mishnah. I should first say that my Rebbe Gedalia Cohen, his name is, must have taught me well, because I internalized many of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. For example, the first time I went to Israel in the 60s, I had a discussion on a train with a rabbi who reprimanded me for my hippie-like appearance. I responded, Al tistakel ba'kankan ela b'masha yesh bo. Don't focus on the bottle, but on what is inside it. That's a lovely editorial comment by the editor of the Mishnah. I don't remember his response, but he must have been surprised by my saying it. And when an Orthodox colleague of mine gleefully informed me many years ago that the then president of Egypt, Gamal Nasser, had died, I said to myself, isn't he aware that it says in Pirkei Avot, B'nefol oyevacha al tismach, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice? I also learned that ein habayishan lomed, one who is embarrassed to ask questions cannot learn. So I learned from Pirkei Avot that I should always ask questions. What does this mean? Why is this so? How do you justify this claim? Asking such questions has been fundamental in my approach to Judaism and also to mathematics. Although I learned to ask questions from Pirkei Avot, one kind of issue that my Rebbe did not discuss with me was, why would Shmuel HaKatan have taught that one should not rejoice at the fall of one's enemies? My sense is that such a warning comes about because people were behaving in exactly the way that was being described. They were rejoicing at the fall of their enemies. So now it's also the case that this quote, this statement, is actually a quote from Proverbs. So this fellow Shmuel Hakatan must have felt some urgency in repeating a biblical verse. So I asked myself, what was the urgency? What could the people have been rejoicing about in the years following the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem? Well, it turns out that 9 years later, something very important happened. That was when the eruption of Vesuvius destroyed the great Roman city of Pompeii. I never thought about that. My Rebbe never knew that. Perhaps there was great rejoicing about that. Perhaps people might have joyfully proclaimed, "You destroyed our city, God destroyed yours." Is that what actually happened? Was Shmuel HaKatan discouraging the glee of his comrades? I don't know, but I suspect that that did happen. There are many other teachings in Pirkei Avot where the context may be relevant. A lot was happening during the 500 years of Avot. Life under Persian rule, then under Greek rule, then under Roman rule. There were conflicts between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, between the schools of Hillel and Shammai, and the rise of Christianity, the rebellions of the Maccabees, and the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. I learned that the greatest annihilation of Jews before the Holocaust took place in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Perhaps 2 million Jews killed or sold into slavery. Yet to this very day, it is not commemorated in any way. We don't mention Hadrian in the same company as Haman and Hitler. None of these historical happenings are mentioned in Pirkei Avot, nor perhaps in the entire Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers and their descendants were focused on building a new Judaism and didn't want to be distracted by current events. In my book, I tried to present, at least to some extent, the historical context of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. I also tried to present in my book the context in which I was writing, the epidemic with which we were all coping, and the political circumstances which plagued us. Very often, the teachings that I was writing about were relevant to the circumstances of the day. So my discussion of Pirkei Avot also serves as a personal memoir of the 2+ years in which it was written. I would often ask myself, would I live long enough to finish this book? I was almost 80 years old, vulnerable to getting COVID. Thousands and thousands of people were dying. Would I live long enough to finish this book? The answer is in Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Tarfon says, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. It is not your responsibility to finish the work. And he adds, Ve'ein ata reshut lehibatel mimena. But you're not permitted to walk away from it. So I persisted and continued my efforts in writing this book. One way my book is different is that I personalize many of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. That is, I describe what many verses have meant to me, like the verse I just mentioned. Or, for example, in response to the teaching that one should align one's will with God's will, I describe how I have tried to do that in my life. While writing this book, I became very frustrated, sometimes depressed, that my leg was not healing properly. And I responded by turning one of Ben Zoma's teaching into a mantra. Ben Zoma said, among other things, who is wealthy? Ezehu Ashir? And he answered, Hasameach b'chelko, the person who is satisfied with what he has. So I repeated to myself over and over, Sameach b'chelko, Sameach b'chelko. Don't focus on what's not working. Focus instead on your many blessings and be grateful for them. By the way, this Ben Zoma, who I just quoted, is the person who is responsible for the existence of the Passover Seder that we just celebrated. In the Haggadah itself, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who is the head of the Sanhedrin, is quoted as saying, "I never thought that we were supposed to recount the story of the Exodus at night until Ben Zoma explained the biblical command to tell the story, quote, all the days of your life in the following way. The days of your life refer to the daytime. All the days of your life refers to night as well. So if it wasn't for Ben Zoma, we wouldn't be having Seders at night." Three major developments in Judaism that took place during the Mishnaic period were the development of the oral Torah, the adoption of the belief in Olam Haba, the world to come, and the rise of rabbinic scholarship. Many Mishnayot in Avot, Mishnayot is the plural of Mishnah, address each of these developments, but usually they are not considered side by side. That is, when we study Pirkei Avot the way we do, Mishnah by Mishnah in order, we don't look at the text broadly. We don't get to see the big picture. In my book, in addition to discussing each Mishnah individually, as is usually done, I bring up at the same time all of the Mishnayot that refer to the same topic. Beyond that, I have included in the book 7 separate, what I call theme chapters, that collect together and discuss all the Mishnayot that relate to 7 specific themes in Pirkei Avot. The first theme chapter deals with what I called, and which is called, the oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh. The first chapter of Pirkei Avot explicitly claims that all of the practices of Judaism that are not in the written Torah, the Torah that we carry around with us and that we read from every Shabbat and every festival, all of the things that we do were commanded orally to Moses by God at Sinai and transmitted from the sages of one generation to the next without change over the 1,000 years from Moses to Hillel. This claim about the oral Torah is examined in the first theme chapter. The next theme chapter deals with all references to Olam Haba, the world to come, and observes that a substantial change occurred between Hillel's first mention of Olam Haba and the compilation of the Mishnah 200 years later. For Hillel, Olam Haba seems to be a reward reserved for Torah scholars. But in the Mishnah it says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek b'olam haba. Every Jew has a portion in Olam Haba. That quote is recited before we begin each new chapter of Pirkei Avot. And you might ask yourself, why is it recited there? Or you might ask me later. The notion of Olam Haba, the world to come, in part provides an answer to the vexing problem of the suffering of the righteous. That is, the solution is that the reward for their righteousness will come in the world to come. However, it's not clear that all of the teachers in Pirkei Avot are on board with Olam Haba, since some of them still refer to this worldly approach to this problem as described in Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat. It says, excuse me, the righteous will grow mighty like a cedar tree, and the wicked doers will perish like grass, all taking place in this world. One of the sages in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Yanai, says simply that we can't explain why the evildoers thrive and the righteous suffer. Although the, quote, party line, unquote, is that the righteous complete their suffering in this world so that in Olam Haba they will receive only rewards. Another theme chapter deals with rewards, which are mentioned many times in Pirkei Avot, implicitly or explicitly, but are not generally linked to Olam Haba. That is surprising, but it is also surprising that rewards are mentioned so frequently, since in the third Mishnah of Avot, the sage Antigonos states very explicitly, do not be like servants who serve the master with the expectation of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward. It appears that this sage advice for a person's relationship with God was rejected. If you study Pirkei Avot, one Mishnah at a time, you might not notice that rewards are mentioned at least 15 times. It is also very surprising that in Avot, although many Mishnayot deal with rewards, very few deal with punishments. And those punishments generally take place in this life. Another theme chapter addresses the importance of studying Torah. And still another theme chapter deals with balancing the study of Torah with earning a living and with doing good deeds. In this period when the study of Torah had become of great value, it was important to remind budding Torah scholars that they had to earn a living and that they could not ignore the needs of others in their community. Still another theme chapter deals with the ethics of the fathers. Not every Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is an ethical teaching, but many do have ethical content. While proceeding through the book, I highlighted the ethical principles that I found and then brought them together and then organized them thematically in a separate chapter. In keeping with the non-halachic character of Avot, many of the ethical principles are not presented as precise instructions, but rather as vague generalizations. What I tried to do was convert the teachings into imperative form, giving statements about what you should do. Since many teachings in Pirkei Avot are ambiguous, they have to be translated into multiple imperatives. For example, im ein ish hishtadel liot ish, which means if there is no ish means man, try to be an ish. Okay. Now, translating this is problematic, not just because of the gender issue, but because we also don't know what circumstance the teacher is talking about. Does he mean that if there is no one else to complete a minyan, then you should do it? Or does he mean that you should never say no to a request for assistance? Or that does he mean that you should be a mensch, even if other people are acting inappropriately? Or does it mean that in a place where no one is standing up for their convictions, stand up for yours? That it urges us to follow our convictions, even if others fail to follow theirs. This teaching was very important for me as a young adult. It told me not to worry about what other people think, not to be discouraged when you stand alone. And I found myself standing alone many times when I was young. Here's another example. What is the meaning of the often cited teaching of Hillel, im ein ani li mili? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Nowadays, we translate this phrase as calling upon each person to stand up for himself or herself, and as calling upon the Jewish people to stand up for themselves. So the imperative version of this statement would be an advocate for yourself. However, Maimonides understood this phrase completely differently. He understood this phrase to be a call to develop your ethical qualities, which no one else can do for you. Other commentators understood this phrase as take responsibility for your own education. If you don't, nobody else will. I can testify to that because I had many students over my 50 years of teaching mathematics who didn't take responsibility for their own education. One interesting question that you might ask if you look at Avot globally is why certain people are mentioned in Avot and other people are not. Even though Antigonos's teaching is essentially ignored by those who came after him, he couldn't be left out of chapter 1 since he is a key chain in the tradition that, quote, proves that there is an oral Torah. But the editors didn't have to keep in Rabbi Yanai, who basically denied Olam Haba. He doesn't appear anywhere else in the Mishnah, so nobody would have noticed if he were left out. On the other hand, Elisha ben Abuya is quoted in Avot. Even though he lost his faith and was excommunicated and is never referred to by his actual name except for here, but is referred to as Acher, that other guy. But Rabbi Meir, who was his student, must have insisted on including his teacher in Avot, and the editor, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, acceded to the wishes of Rabbi Meir, who was his teacher's teacher. But the real puzzle, which I didn't realize all the times that I studied Avot, one Mishnah at a time, is why Rabban Gamliel of Yavna was missing from Avot. He is one of the 5 most important Jews of the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. They were Hillel, Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabban Gamliel is the one who was most responsible for holding the Jewish people together during the troubling period when Christianity was rising and when the temple was destroyed and people were going in all sorts of directions. Yet he is not quoted in Avot. I propose an answer to this question in the book, and I think it may well be correct, but it's too long to explain here, so you'll have to look in the book. At the very beginning of my writing this book, perhaps before I even contemplating writing it, I studied Maimonides' commentary on Avot. And in some ways, my book is a commentary on Maimonides. Maimonides is very careful not to criticize the ancient sages, or the ancient Greeks. However, when he disagrees with what they say, he states his own view somewhere else. So it is not presented as a direct criticism of the teacher. For example, he does not challenge the idea presented in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, that the oral Torah is precisely what was given by God to Moshe at Sinai and passed down from generation to generation. But elsewhere, he describes how the oral Torah was developed over time. Although he doesn't say this explicitly, he seems to be denying that the oral Torah is precisely what God told Moshe. My book is at times critical of Maimonides and sometimes of the text itself. Here's an important example. The Sadducees were the keepers of the temple, and they were the nobility of the Jewish people. They were called Sadukim because they were descendants of Tzadok, who was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, when the first temple was established by Solomon. So the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, that's the transliteration into English, they were high priests for hundreds of years. The Pharisees were an upstart group, in Hebrew, Perushim, literally those who separate themselves. They did so by organizing themselves into a separate party. The first chapter of Avot presents a revisionist view of history, that the Pharisees were the keeper of the oral Torah for 1,000 years, and the Sadducees were the upstarts, rather than the other way around. A companion book called Avot de Rabbi Natan, whose origin and authors are not known, presents the theory that the Sadducees were so named because they were the followers of a wayward student of Antigonus, whose name was also Tzadok. Surprisingly to me, Maimonides repeats this theory without comment. Chapter 1 of Avot is an example of the victors rewriting history from their own perspective. Since once the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees faded from the playing field. To summarize, my book looks not just at individual Mishnayot, but also takes a broader view and looks at a collection of Mishnayot that deal with a shared topic, both in the discussion of the individual Mishnayot, but also in theme chapters dealing with those common topics. It provides some of the historical context in which the sages lived, and also reflects the context in which I was writing. It shares how many of the teachings played out in my life. It compiles and organizes the ethical principles in Pirkei Avot and presents them as imperative statements. and it provides a critique as well as a commentary on Pirkei Avot. It is also different from other books on Pirkei Avot in that this one was written by me. I hope that you will take a closer look at it on my new website, which is simply joerosenstein.com, which also contains many of my other writings from Limud to Limerick. And now it's time for questions. Please be mindful that I tried to keep my remarks to under 30 minutes, almost succeeding. And so
Perfect.
I have oversimplified in some ways.
Joe, tour de force, an absolute tour de force. And you left us with a really great cliffhanger that we've all got to go and research in your book about Rabban Gamliel and why he's not here. We need the answer to that. And I love the way that that numbers kept coming up for you, including in the very logical way that you organize the book. And so I am going to lead us off with the first question for tonight. And I'm going to ask, on the cover, the very cover of your book, it clearly states that this book is written by you, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Mathematics, Rutgers University. Now, that's not the normal way that books on Pirkei Avot are attributed, right? And there are any number of ways that you could have described yourself. I mean, you have been a student and a teacher of Jewish texts as well for much of your life. You are a tremendous you've been engaged in the study of prayer, and you are an author. Why was it important to you to be known as a mathematician who has teachings on Pirkei Avot? Answer that, and then I have a follow-up.
Okay. So first of all, it was really presumptuous of me to write a Siddur and to write a Machzor, because as you know, I have no formal Jewish titles, no formal Jewish, very little formal Jewish education. I have mostly learned over the years on my own with Chavruta, with in the company of friends. So I don't have Jewish credentials. So for writing a Siddur and for writing a Machzor, that's okay. Anybody, prayer is not all that significant in the Jewish world. So writing that is not.
I think it's significant.
I know. I'm being sarcastic, but here I am delving into the world of scholarship, and there are all sorts of people who are academics and who have lots and lots of qualifications to write books on Pirkei Avot, and really, I don't. So that's a reason for my putting myself there, because those are my qualifications. But in fact, those are my scholarly qualifications. I'm a scholar in some area, but in fact, this didn't occur to me. So in other words, if you ask me why I put that on the book, I don't know. I just did. That's who I am, so I don't describe any meaning to it. I tried to think about, did I ever contemplate that question as you think I might have? And I really didn't. I just put that down because that's how I describe myself. That's who I am. On my website, I do describe myself exactly as you say. I describe myself as a teacher and of both of mathematics and of Judaism. And I describe myself as a person who has tried to help people overcome their obstacles to prayer and their obstacles to mathematics. And as you pointed out, I write in a very informal way. And this book, unlike most of the books that are written about Pirkei Avot, which are more scholarly, this book is really for ordinary people to read. Got a lot of footnotes, but the footnotes aren't the usual kind of footnotes. The footnotes, the one usually finds in a scholarly work, are references to all sorts of things. But my footnotes are much more informal. So it has the appearance of a scholarly work, but I don't consider myself, as I point out in the introduction, I don't consider myself a scholar in any of these, in any of the areas that I would need to be a scholar in to write a book about Pirkei Avot, but I have the chutzpah to do it anyways. So I don't know if that answers your
So
question.
no, the mathematician with the humility and with the understanding that this is who I am. I don't have the scholarly qualifications, but also with the chutzpah to say, but nevertheless, I'm going to write a book about
That's
Pirkei
right.
Avot.
That's
Love
right.
it.
And you know, and I don't. I wanted to find out some information, and I looked at a book. I found a book which is a critical edition of Pirkei Avot, which was written about 15 to 20 years ago. It's in Hebrew, and I wanted to look up what it says about a particular verse. I couldn't understand what he wrote, not because of the Hebrew, but because of the scholarly notation that he uses, which was way beyond my pay level, I guess. My pay levels. So someone asked where to buy a copy of the book. So at my website, joerosenstein.com. So I'll keep repeating that if you want.
So Joe, in that vein of accessibility, you know, you speak a lot about and in your talk just now, you brought forward the idea of if you're too shy to ask the question, you're never going to learn. Yes. So I wanted to ask you, you know, has your mathematical training or your teaching in the secular world and years of teaching others shaped the way that you approached Pirkei Avot here?
So I think yes, but not in specific ways that I can point to. I mean, I ask questions. You know, so for example, the simple question about why Shmuel HaKatan would make this statement about not rejoicing when your enemy falls, leaving aside the question of whether he's right or not, why would he make a statement like that, quoting the Proverbs at this time when nobody's rejoicing about anything because the temple was just destroyed? I asked myself that question. It's not a question that I ever asked myself before, but as I was doing it now, I have to ask myself that question. I asked myself the same question when I was writing the Siddur. When I was writing the Siddur, I had to translate every single phrase. And many phrases I came across, I said, what does this mean? I've said it 10,000 times in my life so far, and I've never stopped to say, what does this phrase mean? So just asking that question, what does this mean? Where does this come from? Why is he saying this? Is something which I do, which I did when I was an active mathematician, and something I do when I'm involved in teaching mathematics. I have to ask myself, what is the student's obstacle to understanding this? Someone asks me a question, I have to figure out why are they asking that question. If they don't ask me a question, then of course I can't answer. I can't figure out what they're having trouble with, and I can't help them. So that's where the Ena Bayishan Lomaid comes from. And you know, one of my continual disappointments as a teacher of mathematics was that my students, very few of my students would come and ask me questions, and very many of them ended up either failing that course or failing the next course because they really didn't develop the proper understanding. So that phrase "Ena Bayishan Lomaid," you know, it was like something repeated for me every day as a teacher.
Yeah, so critically important in terms of all of our learning in whatever sphere you enter. And that leads me to the question of accessibility in your book, which you've been really committed to making sure that we can understand and you're not speaking in jargon. And one of the things that I was so struck by was the back of the book. The back of the book of your book is usually reserved, in books, they're usually endnotes or scholarly attributions, and in the back of your book you have summaries and charts, and in some ways they're sort of cliff notes to the rest of the book. What made you include these rather than a customary postscript like an appendix?
Let me say this first. These theme chapters that I mentioned before, I didn't put them all at the end. I put them at the place where I thought they were most relevant because I wanted people to read them. I didn't want people to see them as appendices. So in fact, as I did have a number of people reading the book and offering me comments and suggestions, and some were disturbed by the fact that I was interrupting the normal flow of Pirkei Avot with these theme chapters. But I felt it was important, for example, to talk about the oral Torah after the first chapter, because that's what it related to. And since the Olam Haba, the world to come, was mentioned in the second chapter, I thought it was important to put that in the second chapter, at the end of the second chapter. And for example, the story of Rabbi Gamliel, which you referred to, I put it in the middle of the second chapter because that's where the answer emerges. I put in a section called "How many is 10?" So because if you look at chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot, it starts out by giving anonymously half a dozen Mishnayot, each of which starts, there are 10 such and such, there are 10 such and such. And if you look at it carefully, which I never did before, it turns out that very rarely is it exactly 10. It's sort of, so the question is, how many is 10? Does 10 mean 10 or does 10 mean about 10?
Did that frustrate you as a mathematician?
No, not at all. It didn't frustrate me. It was very interesting that was the case. But at the end, for example, I felt it was important to, I mentioned Maimonides a great deal. Maimonides wrote an extensive introduction to Avot, and I thought it was important for me to put at the end a summary of that introduction, because I wanted to refer to it. And I felt that if I refer to it so many times, I should at least put in front of people what it says. At the end, I was, after I'd finished the book, I was confused because of the names of the people, and I couldn't remember who was where. And so I had this page there at the end, not page, but
this great chart
where I give alphabetically the names of all of the people who are mentioned in Pirkei Avot.
It's worth the cost of admission just for this chart alone, let alone the very cool mystery of Rabban Gamliel.
Yes, so I include Rabban Gamliel in the chart, even though he's not there. So I just as my little zing into the editor of Pirkei Avot. One chart I had originally, but it left out, was a chart which was a chart which compared the different enumerations of the Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot. If you have many of you, I'm sure, have your own commentary on Pirkei Avot, and if you compare the numbering of the Mishnayot from one edition to another, they're often different. So it turns out that there were about 5 different versions of Pirkei Avot in the Middle Ages. We know that Maimonides had a different version than we do, because he had a different version of Antigonos's statement than is the customary one. And I was going to have a chart which showed the relationships between all of the different numberings, but then I decided that probably everyone had their own numbering, and so that I would have to have a chart which was way too complicated for anybody to understand. So I didn't do that.
Great. Someday you can send it our way. Louise, you had a great question. Would you like to share it?
Well, I said that I spent a lot of your presentation smiling at your wit, and I asked whether humor has any place in Pirkei Avot, and also how do you see its role in Jewish learning? And I also thanked you. I appreciate being made to smile.
So thank you. So I have a story to tell about that. One of the great teachers at the Jewish Theological Seminary was Saul Lieberman, and one of his students, who I won't name, impertinently asked him if there was any humor in the Talmud, and he said, "Yes, it says scholars increase peace in the world." So that was his example of humor in the Talmud, because in fact, it's not at all clear that scholars always have that consequence. So is there humor in Pirkei Avot? So I don't think I identified anything which was humorous there. So on that score, I'm going to have to disappoint you, I'm afraid. But you may. But I think I probably, as Michelle pointed out, I probably did use some humor in my discussion of the Pirkei Avot.
Great. So I don't see Esther on the screen, so I'm going to ask her question. Oh, there you are, Esther. You've popped up now. Thank you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Well, my question was, and I loved your comments, was what your favorites are. I know you shared about Sameach B'Chalko as your mantra or whatever, but I wondered if you had others that were your favorites.
So there are many that are favorites. You know, it's to ask for my favorite. I'm reminded I once fainted a few years ago, and I was taken off to the hospital, and the doctor comes up to me and he introduces himself as the doctor at the emergency room, and he asks me whether Psalm 23 or Psalm 27 is my favorite, which was the strangest thing that ever happened to me, I'm sure, because obviously, I mean, I realized obviously what he had done is he saw me come in and he said, this is a person I want to find out more about. So he Googled me and he found out that I had a meditation tape of Psalm 23 and Psalm 27. So my response was, that's like asking me which of my children is my favorite. So the same thing here. There are many favorite phrases here in Pirkei Avot, and many of us, if you've studied them, you've seen them. I certainly have not mentioned all of my favorites, and you probably have your favorites as well. But there are many things in Pirkei Avot which are not so illuminating. Even one of the statements that Hillel makes, I sort of shrug my shoulders and say, "What in the world is he talking about?" So there are many favorites, and there are many. They're not all of equal quality.
So actually, I'm going to jump in on that and ask you: were there any of these texts that you absolutely just didn't have anything to say about, that they just didn't make sense to you in a way that you had a comment about them?
There were only, I felt that I had to make a comment about everyone. Which reminds me that Maimonides says that one of the characteristics of a good teacher is that he is brief. Of course, he takes a lot of words to say that. So I felt I needed to say something about each one, and so there is something about each one. But certainly, some there's much more to say about. Maimonides himself, in his commentary on Avot, he didn't comment on everything, and on some things he went on at great length. For example, one of his really strong comments, in agreement with something that Rabbi Akiva said and someone else had said beforehand, was that teachers of Torah should not be paid for their teaching. And that's something that was rejected completely throughout our history. In Pirkei Avot, it does not say that the community should support those who want to study Torah. It says that those who study Torah should find an occupation. They should not use Torah as a as a spade to dig by, is the metaphor they use. And Maimonides was very strong on that, that he denounced people who were paid for studying Torah or for teaching Torah. And he went on a great length about that. Whereas on other things, he was relatively silent, even some things where you would have expected him to say something.
Interesting. So Steve and Anne.
So thank you, Joe, for your presentation. I was thinking what you said about Maimonides, that must have made him really popular in many yeshivas.
He is not studied in yeshivas because of such things.
Yeah.
Maimonides is not in the curriculum of most yeshivas, I'm told. I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm looking for a source for, I put this in the chat. There's a saying that I recall that is something like, when two are in love, they can sleep on the side of a knife. And I'm not sure, but is that in Pirkei Avot? And
No, that's not in Pirkei Avot, and I've never heard that before. So I don't know. So that's something new to me.
Yeah, anybody out there? Maybe it's Mark Twain. Maybe it was our TikTok Talmud person from Sunday, but
it's
right,
certainly truth.
It's totally true.
Anne.
So, Joe, first of all, thank you for doing this work that you've done and allowing us to benefit from it. I just have been thinking about the fact that you have spent so very much of your very unique life as a professor of mathematics. And if we've studied mathematics, we certainly are aware of the fact that math and teachers of math change how we view the world. When we learn, it changes how we view the world. So I guess my question for you in regards to the amount of time that you've now spent with Pirkei Avot, how do you hope that this piece that you have done will change how we look at Pirkei Avot or how we look at studying Pirkei Avot?
Well, I think the main point that I made was that we usually, and that includes myself, study Pirkei Avot one Mishnah at a time. And we need to look at it more broadly, look at the big picture. And I hope that, what I've written will have that effect. I'm not overly optimistic that it will have a great impact, because it's not going to be acceptable in the Orthodox world, and in the non-Orthodox world, there are not that many people who are interested enough in Pirkei Avot to buy yet another one. So I don't know whether it will have that impact, but I would like it to have that impact, and perhaps it will to some extent.
Joe,
yes.
My follow-up is that not so much in regards to the order itself, but more how does looking at it in a different way, i.e. not so much by order, but perhaps by theme, how does that change how we view it and what we learn from it and what we take away in terms of application to the rest of the world by looking at it I understand that your order is different, but do you have hopes that in changing that order, that it will have a significant impact on us?
No, I did not change the order.
Changing the order to study it. I'm sorry. I know you didn't change the order.
Well, right. Okay. So I think if you look at it from a bigger perspective, that you see it differently. So, for example, one Mishnah says that Rabbi Meir says at one point, there's another Mishnah which says even more, says that I will not teach my son anything but Torah. Why? Because ultimately that's the only important thing. Well, that's a very striking statement. And if you look at that in isolation, it sounds like this person says that one should spend, not one, but everyone should spend all of their time learning Torah. But that's not where the conversation ends. That's one person's view. So it's very important to recognize that the last word, so to speak, is the second Mishnah of the second chapter, which is by Gamliel, the son of Yehuda Hanasi. So even though Yehuda Hanasi was supposed to have completed the work, actually his son is quoted in it, and his son says that it's very important to have Torah im derech eretz, Torah together with an occupation. And so you see that there is a conversation that has taken place over the years, scattered through the book, and it does have, and if you look at it from a historical perspective, you see that there is a conclusion that it comes to, which is not that of the individual speakers, but something which is, takes that into account and does something more broad than that. So
Well,
a different way of looking at it does lead you to that kind of conclusion. Similarly with Olam Haba, you see what Hillel says about Olam Haba, and you see that he says something which is very different from what is said 200 years later. So so looking at it from that perspective, you see the text quite differently than you do if you look at it one piece at a time. Now, I wanted to mention something. Michelle asked me before, what about how Pirkei Avot relates to prayer, and so I didn't discuss that in the book, and so I went and looked, and I was very surprised to find that there's only one Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that deals with prayer, which is in my book, the 16th Mishnah in chapter 2. Otherwise, prayer is not mentioned, and I was very surprised by that, and I didn't notice it, even though I have this big picture perspective. It's mentioned one other time. It says that you should pray for the welfare of your government, because if it were not for the fear of the government, and it uses an idiom, a metaphor of fish, one would swallow the other alive, as fish do. And it's a very striking Mishnah in itself, but it is the only other one that refers to prayer. The one that refers to prayer says, pay particular attention to the Shema and the Amidah. And then it says, Al taseh tfilatcha keva. Don't make your prayer routine, ritualized, rote. And that's exactly what I try to counter in my Siddur and my Machzor, to try to figure out what did the authors of the prayers have in mind. What are they trying to tell us over 1,000 years ago, using their own language, which we have to translate into our language. And what I tried to do was, as I said in the Siddur, recapture the wow experience of prayer in my Siddur. So that's a real connection between what I have and what's in the one Mishnah, which deals with prayer in Pirkei Avot. It is a little surprising that prayer is not does not play a larger role, but as I said, I didn't know that until I was asked the question. I went looking and I said, that's interesting.
So that's why this conversation is so generative. So I want to,
I'll
go
put
ahead,
that in the next edition. I'm sorry.
Perfect. So, Joe, I just want to end our conversation tonight by asking you, and I know that some of this is because the printing of books sort of requires this in how many sheets you have. But I noticed in your book, there are 3 blank pages at the end. They're completely white, completely blank. What would you hope that we would do with these 3 blank pages?
So I have to confess that I had nothing to do with them.
That's okay, intentional or unintentional. In this moment, give us a blessing. What do you want us to do with those 3 blank pages?
May you all write in those pages the wisdom that you derive from Pirkei Avot and how it affects your own lives. So Pirkei Avot is really an amazing book, has amazing things to say. And it's really quite striking that all of these things were said 2,000 years ago. And that in many ways, human beings have not changed all that much in that time, because the advice that they give is generally as valuable now as it was then. So may everybody find some their own advice from the sages and put it down in the book.
Amen. God bless. Thank you so much, Joe, for this amazing evening with you and with our sages. Thank you for bringing them to life for us. Lila Tov, everyone. Go buy the book.
Go buy the book.